My name is Joe Whitchurch, and I'm here with my friend,
Michael Back.
and we have a story to tell you. We're located here at Purdue University. We're here for the Symposia Christi, the book that changed the world, and we haven't seen each other for how many years?
At least 35.
At least
30, well, I've been married 35 years, so 36 or 37.
That's amazing. I used to work at Beloit College, and I felt like a total failure there. I felt like I wasn't able to get through to the students at all. And one day I met Michael, and he was telling me about some source criticism and some very harsh skepticism he was having in one of his theology classes. And I knew that that day I had actually bought the book Evidence Demands a Verdict, Volume 2, which talks about source criticisms, form criticism, JEDP theory, and I wanted to read that book. But I knew from his class that this would help him. And I gave him the book. I don't think I ever saw you again. I stopped working at Beloit College, never wondered if anything came of it or not, and I never bought that book again. But anyway, years later, why don't you pick us up in terms of, we fell out of touch.
At the time, I think I was 18 or 19, and Joe was working for University Christian Fellowship. I was actually the president of our local chapter, and when he would come on campus, I don't know if he remembers this, I would always meet him for lunch.
Yeah.
And so we met for lunch that day, and I just broke down and told him about how a professor was dismantling my faith with the documentary hypothesis, form criticism, and I had no defense for that. I was a kid. And he opened up his briefcase, and there were two books inside. There was his Bible, and there was this other book written by Josh McDowell. He said, "I have a book for you." And he handed me the book. It was his Volume 2, More Evidence That Demands Verdict. And I took it home, and I took it back to my room, and I just devoured it, and it saved my faith. It was as though it were written for my class. He addressed everything in it. Now, because of that, when you're first reading something, it's impacting you, but it takes a while to percolate to where you can regurgitate it. In the meantime, in this class, I found myself inadequate to save the faith of some of the other people in the class. But this book had such a huge impact on me when Joe gave it to me that I determined in that moment that I was going to pour myself into this, into apologetics, into research. I was going to learn the languages. I was going to do whatever it took so that no person would ever be able to unravel the faith of another person while I was in the room. And so,
You got that letter.
30-some years later, I've ministered to literally thousands of students in apologetics and just teaching and preaching, teaching Greek classes. Everything always relates back to Christianity. And I got to thinking, I'm holding that, I happened to pull it out. It was a required reading in all of my classes, Josh McDowell's book. By this time, it was the New Evidence That Demands Verdict.
We had both. Yeah.
And it was both in there. And I got to thinking, and I remembered that it was Joe who had given it to me, and I had completely lost track of him, 30 years. And so I got on the internet, and I began doing a search for Joe Whitchurch.
Couldn't get my last name. My last name was weird, because you were telling people this story.
Right. I couldn't remember. He was Joe somebody.
It's a weird last
And
name.
yeah, and
Not
and
as
so
easy as back.
actually for about 2 years, I struggled. My wife could not remember his last name. I couldn't remember his last name for about 2 years. And I happened to find a letter that I had written to another student on campus, and in the letter I said, "So how is Joe Whitchurch?" And I went, "Oh my gosh, that's his name." So I did an internet search, and I tracked down a Joe Whitchurch who was still at the time with University Christian Fellowship.
Just 6 months ago, right?
And I said, this has got to be him. So I wrote this long thing telling the story.
Made me cry.
And thanking him
Still makes me
because he saved by handing me a book that he hadn't had a chance to read, that he had just purchased. He saved my faith and the faith of so many thousands of people afterwards.
Praise the Lord.
And I wanted
Ripple
him to know
effect.
that. And I didn't find out until later that he had thought his ministry at Beloit had no impact.
It was a washout.
Yes,
Total.
and it wasn't because the legacy of that, the fruit from that, is thousands of students. I have taught apologetics for homeschool students. I've taught it in churches. I've taught it in colleges. And in fact, I just recently at an area church. Yeah, at an area church, I just taught a 4-week seminar every Sunday, 3 hours, a seminar on apologetics, just going over all of it. And I didn't even know what apologetics was until he handed me that book.
So we say, praise the Lord.
So anyway, that's the testimony that I have of how we don't know at any given moment. He drove home literally from giving me that book, beating himself up over the fact that he hadn't had a chance to read it without knowing that he had saved a life. Because I would have walked away from the faith. I would not have married my wife. All of my children are going into ministry. All of the people that I have ministered to over the years, it was because he gave up a book that he didn't know that he had bought for me, not for him.